Alexander the Great Lion Conqueror. The echoes of Gaugamela had barely faded when Alexander and his army entered Babylon, the city of legends, a place that seemed less like a mortal realm and more like the playground of gods. Babylon, once the shining jewel of the East, exuded wealth and decadence, its ziggurats rising like stone giants watching over a city that hummed with the riches of countless civilizations. Here, in the heart of the Persian Empire, Alexander's men found themselves awestruck by the splendor of the Golden City. Babylon's gates opened to Alexander as a conqueror, but the city itself opened its soul as a temptress. The streets shimmered under the brilliance of gold and precious stones, gardens overflowed with rare and exotic plants, and its halls were filled with silks and perfumes that seemed to carry the very breath of the East. This was no ordinary city, it was a seat of power and luxury, the embodiment of centuries of wealth, now at the feet of a young king who had brought Persia's might to its knees. For the Greeks, Babylon was more than just a prize. It was a city that represented everything they had heard of the East: decadence, wealth, and indulgence beyond imagination. They reveled in its pleasures, basking in the luxury they had only heard whispers of. Even the deeply spiritual Alexander found himself enchanted by the opulence of Babylon's court. Here the beautiful women of Babylon gathered to entertain the conqueror of the world. Alexander and his men enjoyed their short time of peace, finding balance as they lounged in Babylon's grand palaces, drinking in the city's excesses. Yet amid this paradise, a shadow loomed. It is said that Alexander, while in Babylon, came into the company of a Babylonian physician. Unbeknownst to him, this man would become his slow undoing. It is believed that the physician administered a substance, perhaps mercury or another subtle poison, that would slowly wear down the great conqueror. What began as a seemingly benign influence would, over time, manifest in the decline of Alexander's health, his once indomitable mind slowly unraveling as his journey continued. The Blues had fled Babylon before his arrival, their plans disrupted by his victories, but their influence lingered, lurking in the shadows, working through subtle means to undo the one who threatened their hold on the world. During his stay in Babylon, Alexander's mind was not only occupied by luxury. From the wisdom passed down by the priests of Jerusalem and the seer of Siwa, Alexander now fully understood the depth of the stories about Assyria and the manipulations of the ancient Blues. The Assyrian legacy, lost in the sands of time, echoed in the halls of Babylon. The ancient temples held within them remnants of the forgotten world, where the Blues had once held dominion over the minds of kings and the souls of nations. Alexander, keenly aware of their influence, made it his mission to uncover any trace of their manipulation, poring over ancient texts and artifacts. Every scrap of knowledge he gathered was destined for a greater purpose, a repository of wisdom that would become the famed library of Alexandria. Babylon, for all its temptations, was merely a waypoint. Alexander's vision extended beyond the walls of this golden city. He knew his true purpose lay further to the east. The Blues had spread their tendrils far and wide, and if he was to break their hold on the world, he had to chase them to the ends of the earth. The path ahead led him to the gates of the world, the formidable pass that guarded the eastern reaches of the Persian Empire. This was no ordinary battle, it was the gateway to the farthest corners of the known world, and Alexander's pursuit of Darius III had become a symbol of his quest to eradicate the forces that had for so long manipulated humanity. Darius had fled east after Gaugamela, desperately trying to regroup, but Alexander was relentless. His army surged forward, cutting through the Persian ranks like an unstoppable force of nature, driven by the knowledge that the Blues could not be allowed to escape once more. As they clashed at the gates of the world, Alexander's men fought with a ferocity that came not only from their king's commands but from a deep sense of destiny. The very air crackled with the intensity of their purpose. Darius, once again facing defeat, attempted to flee, but his own generals betrayed him, leaving him to die in the unforgiving deserts of Bactria. The death of Darius marked the end of the Achaemenid Empire, but for Alexander, it was far more than the fall of a mere king. It was the end of an era. The centuries-old empire, constructed on the backs of enslaved peoples and manipulated by unseen hands, had finally crumbled. The Blues, those ancient forces of deceit and corruption, had been routed from their strongholds, and their empire lay in ruins. Alexander's journey was not yet complete. Though he had conquered Persia and its wealth now flowed into his coffers, he knew that the real prize was the knowledge, the truth hidden in the temples and the forgotten cities. Each new land he entered brought with it more secrets, more remnants of the Blues' machinations. Every piece of this ancient puzzle was carefully collected and sent back west, destined to fill the shelves of the Library of Alexandria, a beacon of knowledge and truth, where the collected wisdom of the world would be stored for all future generations to learn from. As Alexander pushed further east, towards India and beyond, his health slowly deteriorated. The poison, administered subtly over time, began to take its toll on the great king's body and mind. His once clear and sharp vision began to blur, and moments of doubt and confusion crept into his thoughts. But even as his health declined, his drive remained unwavering. The Blues had been scattered, their influence shattered, but Alexander knew that their presence could never be fully eradicated. They would burrow into new lands, create new empires, and manipulate new leaders. His task was not just to conquer, but to ensure that the truth of their existence was known, that humanity would never again fall under their control. As his campaign wore on, Alexander's men followed him not out of loyalty alone, but out of a shared belief in his divine mission. They knew their king was unlike any other. He was more than a warrior, he was a liberator, a man touched by the gods, destined to break the chains that had bound humanity for so long. The heat of northern India hung thick and heavy as Alexander and his men stood poised at the edge of battle, their final confrontation against the forces that had evaded them across continents. Before them stretched the vast plains, where King Porus' army awaited, and with them, the creatures that sent shivers through the ranks of even the bravest Macedonian soldiers, war elephants. These towering beasts, with their tusks gleaming and their armored bodies shimmering in the sunlight, were the very embodiment of terror, creatures unlike anything the Greeks had faced before. Alexander, the Lion of Macedonia, had led his men through the ends of the known world, chasing not just kings and armies but the shadowy tendrils of the ancient Blues, whose manipulations had spanned the centuries. Now, standing at the pinnacle of his conquests, his men knew they were fighting not just for glory, but for a deeper, spiritual victory against the forces of oppression that had enslaved nations and crushed cultures. As the armies lined up, the men could see the war elephants arrayed before them, their eyes glowing with an almost supernatural intensity. Each one was a living fortress, clad in spiked armor, with massive towers perched atop their backs, filled with archers and javelin throwers. Their sheer size dwarfed the horses and soldiers that stood ready to face them. These were not just animals, they were war machines, bred for destruction, and they carried with them the weight of fear that the Persians had once wielded. As the battle began, the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the thunderous footsteps of the elephants. Their charge was a force of nature, like mountains in motion, a wall of muscle, tusks, and rage surging forward. The sound of their trumpeting filled the air, mingling with the screams of men and the clash of weapons. Alexander, in his brilliance, had anticipated this moment. His men had been trained for this, their formation tightened into wedges, with the light infantry spreading out to harass the elephants with javelins and arrows, while the phalanxes braced for impact. The cavalry, led by Alexander himself, prepared to flank the elephants and drive deep into Porus' ranks. The monstrous beasts of war, with their towering tusks and frenzied trumpeting, crashed into the front lines. Spears shattered against their thick hides, and soldiers were flung aside like ragdolls as the beasts rampaged through the ranks. Men screamed as they were trampled underfoot, their bodies crushed beneath tons of raw muscle. The Macedonians, despite their courage, found themselves battling not only men but the sheer force of nature itself. But Alexander, ever the tactician, knew that the elephant's strength was also their weakness. As the beasts charged, they became isolated from the rest of Porus' army, their handlers struggling to control their wild fury. The Macedonian phalanxes, disciplined and unyielding, moved as one. Spears jabbed into the elephants' legs and bellies, seeking the vulnerable spots between the plates of armor. The light infantry harried the beasts relentlessly, darting in to strike before retreating, forcing the elephants into a frenzy. Some of the elephants, maddened by pain, turned back into their own ranks, trampling the soldiers they were meant to protect. The Greek cavalry, swift and decisive, exploited these gaps, sweeping around the flanks of the elephants to attack Porus' infantry. The elephants, powerful as they were, could not stem the tide of the Macedonian onslaught. Amid the chaos, Alexander himself was everywhere, his gleaming armor and lion-crested helmet a beacon for his men. He fought like a man possessed, his sword flashing as he cut down enemies in his path, leading his cavalry in daring charges. Each thrust and swing of his blade was fueled by the knowledge of what was at stake. This was not just a battle for territory or wealth, this was a battle to rid the world of an ancient darkness. As the day wore on, the battle turned in favor of the Greeks. The elephants, once thought invincible, lay dead or dying on the battlefield, their bodies massive obstacles amid the chaos. Porus, fighting valiantly atop his own elephant, was surrounded by Alexander's forces. Even in defeat, he stood tall, a king who had fought with honor against the greatest conqueror the world had ever known. When Porus was finally captured, blooded but unbroken, Alexander approached him not as a conqueror but as a fellow warrior. He saw in Porus a reflection of himself, a man bound by honor, standing firm even in the face of overwhelming odds. "How would you have me treat you?" Alexander asked, and Porus, with all the dignity of a fallen king, replied, "As a king treats another king." And so, Alexander spared him, not out of mercy, but out of respect. The Blues had been routed once more, their control over the kingdoms of the East broken, and Alexander, though victorious, was already setting his sights on the next horizon. But victory came at a cost. As Alexander stood on the battlefield, surrounded by the dead and the dying, the slow poison that had been working its way through his body since Babylon began to take its toll. The battles had become more difficult, his once boundless energy sapped by the venom that coursed through his veins. Though he had conquered the world, his mind and body were beginning to falter. In the months that followed, as Alexander pressed further into the unknown lands beyond India, his health continued to decline. The once great lion of Macedonia, who had brought down empires and chased the Blues to the ends of the earth, now found himself fighting a battle within. His dreams, once filled with visions of unity and glory, were now haunted by shadows, the poison clouding his mind and weakening his spirit. But even as his life waned, Alexander's legacy burned bright. The Blues, scattered and weakened, had been chased from their strongholds. The knowledge and treasures of the ancient world, gathered from the temples and cities he had conquered, would find their way to the library of Alexandria, where they would be preserved for future generations. As Alexander the Great lay dying, although his work was far from finished, his name would echo through the ages, not just as a conqueror of lands, but as a liberator of the human spirit, a man who had struck at the heart of the ancient forces that had sought to enslave the world. In the twilight of his life, Alexander's journey took on a deeply spiritual significance that transcended mere conquest. What had begun as a mission of vengeance, reclaiming lost honor and the dignity of nations destroyed by the Blues, evolved into something far more profound. As he traversed the lands of Egypt, Persia, and beyond, Alexander became more than a warrior king. He embodied the spiritual kinship that connected the peoples of the ancient world. His understanding of the gods and the sacred was not confined to the pantheon of his homeland, but expanded as he encountered new deities and traditions that resonated with his soul. In Egypt, where he was proclaimed the son of Amunzus, Alexander came to understand the concept of divine kingship in its deepest sense. He embraced the idea that the gods of different peoples were not separate, but aspects of a greater whole, a rainbow of understanding, united by a single thread of spiritual truth. In the Temple of Siwa, he realized his role not only as a conqueror but as a bridge between the old world and the new, between the divine and the mortal. This moment of enlightenment revealed to him that his destiny was far greater than empire. It was a sacred duty to unite and honor the spiritual heritage of all peoples. His open understanding with Amunzus, the father figure who unified the divine authority of Greece and Egypt, helped him recognize the sacred kinship he shared with the faithful of all lands. From Amun-Ra to Baal-Hammon, from the Zoroastrian Magi to the priest of Judaism, Alexander saw the core truth that all these religions held an ancient connection that ran through humanity's shared spiritual heritage. He honored these traditions, not through domination, but by seeking to understand the wisdom they carried, knowing that they were pieces of a larger, cosmic puzzle. In Babylon, at the heart of what was once the greatest empire of the ancient world, he encountered the opulence and decadence of a city built upon the labor and blood of its people, enslaved spiritually and financially. Yet even here, Alexander saw beyond the material splendor to the ancient wisdoms still hidden in the temples. He sought out every scrap of knowledge, every relic of the old faiths, to preserve them for the future. In doing so, he affirmed that his reign, though brief, would be remembered not for the lands he conquered but for the legacy of unity and understanding he left behind. But the price for this understanding was his own life. Poisoned slowly by those who feared the light he would cast on the deeper heritage of all peoples, Alexander succumbed not to battle, but to betrayal. Yet even in death, his legacy remained untarnished. He had been the Lion Conqueror, the King of Kings, but more importantly, he had been a spiritual guardian, protecting the shared history of humanity from the clutches of the Blues. Although in time they would divide and conquer the empire Alexander had created, the Blues, with their well-practiced manipulation and deceit, could not destroy the unity Alexander had forged in the hearts of those he touched. His was a reign not of swords alone but of souls bound by a common truth, a truth stretching back to Amun-Ra, Baal-Hamon, and beyond. In the end, Alexander's story is one of spiritual awakening, where he came to see himself as part of a greater whole, a heritage not of division but of deep, sacred unity that bound the peoples of the earth together in a timeless understanding. Through his conquests, he illuminated the path toward a future where the light of ancient wisdom would never be extinguished.